Now, I'm going to share a page. Let's see. Mr. Bagby has to find that again. Share screen, here it is. All right. And that's not the page I wanted to share. So stop share. Let's try again. Share screen. There it is. Nod your head if you can see Roald Dahl. Yay. All right, let's get started. And as people pop in, I'll try to get you included. But remember, this meeting starts, it's going to start every single morning at 9:30. So you guys need to be here on time and ready to roll. Roald Dahl, James and the Giant Peach, illustrated by Quentin Blake. Until he was 4 years old, James Henry Trotter had had a happy life. He lived peacefully with his mother and father in a beautiful house beside the sea. There were always plenty of other children for him to play with, and there was sandy beach for him to run about on and the ocean to paddle in. It was the perfect life for a small boy. Then one day, James' mother and father went to London to do some shopping, and there a terrible thing happened. Both of them suddenly got eaten up in full daylight, mind you, and on a crowded street, by an enormous, angry rhinoceros, which had escaped from the London Zoo. Now this, as you can well imagine, was a rather nasty experience for two such gentle parents. But in the long run, it was far nastier for James than it was for them. Their troubles were over in a jiffy. They were dead and gone in 35 seconds flat. Poor James, on the other hand, was still very much alive, and all at once he found himself alone and frightened in a vast, unfriendly world. The lovely house by the seaside had to be sold immediately, and the little boy, carrying nothing but a small suitcase containing a pair of pajamas and a toothbrush, was sent away to live with his two aunts. Their names were Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker, and I'm sorry to say that they were both really horrible people. They were selfish and lazy and cruel, and right from the beginning, they started beating poor James for almost no reason at all. They never called him by his real name, but always referred to him as, "You disgusting little beast," or "You filthy nuisance," or "You miserable creature." And they certainly never gave him any toys to play with or any picture books to look at. His room was as bare as a prison cell. They lived, Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker, and now James as well, in a queer ramshackle house on the top of a high hill in the south of England. The hill was so high that from almost anywhere in the garden, James could look down and see for miles and miles across a marvelous landscape of woods and fields, and on a very clear day, if he looked in the right direction, he could see a tiny gray dot far away on the horizon, which was the house that he used to live in with his beloved father and mother. And just beyond that, he could see the ocean itself, a long, thin streak of blackish blue, like a line of ink beneath the rim of the sky. But James was never allowed to go down off the top of that hill. Neither Aunt Sponge nor Aunt Spiker could ever be bothered to take him out herself, not even for a small walk or a picnic, and he certainly wasn't permitted to go alone. "The nasty little beast will only get into mischief if he goes out of the garden," Aunt Spiker had said, and terrible punishments were promised him, such as being locked up in the cellar with the rats for a week, if he even so much as dared to climb over the fence. The garden, which covered the whole of the top of the hill, was large and desolate, and the only tree in the entire place, apart from the clump of dirty old laurel bushes at the far end, was an ancient peach tree that never gave any peaches. There was no swing, no seesaw, no sandpit, and no other children were ever invited to come up the hill to play with poor James. There wasn't so much as a dog or a cat around to keep him company. And as time went on, he became sadder and sadder and more lonely. And he used to spend hours every day standing at the bottom of the garden, gazing wistfully at the lovely but forbidden world of woods and fields and ocean that was spread out below him like a magic carpet. Chapter 2. After James Henry Trotter had been living with his aunts for 3 whole years, there came a morning when something rather peculiar happened to him. And this thing, which I say was only rather peculiar, soon caused a second thing to happen, which was very peculiar. And then the very peculiar thing, in its own turn, caused a really fantastically peculiar thing to occur. It all started on a blazing hot day in the middle of summer. Aunt Sponge, Aunt Spiker, and James were all out in the garden. James had been put to work as usual. This time he was chopping wood for the kitchen stove. Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker were sitting comfortably in deck chairs nearby, sipping tall glasses of fizzy lemonade and watching him to see that he didn't stop work for one moment. Aunt Sponge was enormously fat and very short. She had small, piggy eyes, a sunken mouth, and one of those flat, white, flabby faces that looked exactly as though it had been boiled. She was like a great, white, soggy, overboiled cabbage. Aunt Spiker, on the other hand, was lean and tall and bony, and she wore steel-rimmed spectacles that fixed onto the end of her nose with a clip. She had a screeching voice and long, wet, narrow lips, and whenever she got angry or excited, little flecks of spit would come shooting out of her mouth as she talked. And there they sat, these two ghastly hags, sipping their drinks and every now and again screaming at James to chop faster and faster. They also talked about themselves, each one saying how beautiful she thought she was. Aunt Sponge had a long-handled mirror on her lap, and she kept picking it up and gazing at her own hideous face. "Oh, I look and smell as lovely as a rose," Aunt Sponge declared. "Just feast your eyes upon my face. Observe my shapely nose. Behold my heavenly silky locks. And if I take off both my socks, you'll see my dainty toes. Ah, but don't forget," Aunt Spiker cried, "how much your tummy shows." Aunt Sponge went red. Aunt Spiker said, "My sweet, you cannot win. Behold my gorgeous curvy shape, my teeth, my charming grin. Oh, beauteous me, how I adore my radiant looks. And please ignore the pimple on my chin." "My dear old trout," Aunt Sponge cried, "you're only bones and skin. Such loveliness as I possess can only truly shine in Hollywood," Aunt Sponge declared. "Oh, wouldn't that be fine? I'd capture all the nation's hearts. They'd give me all the leading parts. The stars would all resign." "I think you'd make," Aunt Spiker said, "a lovely Frankenstein." Poor James was still slaving away at the chopping block. The heat was terrible. He was sweating all over. His arm was aching. The chopper was a large, blunt thing, far too heavy for a small boy to use. And as he worked, James began thinking about all the other children in the world and what they might be doing at this moment. Some would be riding tricycles in their gardens. Some would be walking in cool woods and picking bunches of wild flowers. And all the little friends whom he used to know would be down by the seaside, playing in the wet sand and splashing around in the water. Great tears began oozing out of James's eyes and rolling down his cheeks. He stopped working and leaned against the chopping block, overwhelmed by his own unhappiness. "What's the matter with you?" Aunt Spiker screeched, glaring at him over the top of her steel spectacles. James began to cry. "Stop that immediately and get on with your work, you nasty little beast," Aunt Sponge ordered. "Oh, Auntie Sponge," cried James, "and Auntie Spiker, couldn't we all please, just for once, go down to the seaside on the bus? It isn't very far, and I feel so hot and awful and lonely." "Why, you're lazy, good-for-nothing brute. Beat him," cried Aunt Sponge. "I certainly will," Aunt Spiker snapped. She glared at James, and James looked back at her with large, frightened eyes. "I shall beat you later on in the day when I don't feel so hot," she said. "And now get out of my sight, you disgusting little worm, and give me some peace." James turned and ran. He ran off as fast as he could to the far end of the garden and hid himself behind that clump of dirty old laurel bushes that we mentioned early on. Then he covered his face with his hands and began to cry and cry. End of chapter 1 and 2. So you have a question comparing, you guys can unmute your microphones now, a question comparing James's life with his parents before they were eaten by a rhinoceros, and his life now with Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker, who are two of the most loathsome characters in all of Roald James books. Roald Dahl books. I was thinking of James. Okay, so today you have a question to answer. You have projects to watch from your fellow students. You have all the other things. You should be practicing those 25 words. 25 words will be tested on Thursday. And if you remember that the vocabulary test before, there's going to be a box of 5 words, and next to it will be a box of 5 definitions that you have to match up. And for the spelling part of it, all 5 words will have 3 different choices of spellings for you to choose. And you'll have to choose and highlight the one that you think is the correct spelling. So a lot of honesty and trust I'm putting in for you to do this correctly. Any questions? Go ahead, Kyla.
Can you make the coronavirus disappear so we can go back to normal school?
Oh, sure. Ready? Let's all close our eyes. Alakazam 1, Alakazam 2, Alakazam 3. Poof!
Poof.
Wouldn't life be wonderful if we could do that? Well, at least we started Zoom. I really like this. I just wish everybody would join in that can. Because right now I'm looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Let me take attendance here real quick. Is Cheyenne here? Yes. Macio's here? Yes. Kyla's here. Graham is here. Is Eli here?
And you should tell him about the TV show you've been watching. That'd be good for
yeah.
Who is Mad Hugh? Mad who?
Me.
That's Rohan.
Rohan? Okay. All right. And Zoe. Haley's here. Zach here? No. All right. What were you going to say, Graham?
You know how you have those gifted thinking things?
Yes.
There's a show on Disney Plus called Brain Games, and it's like that.
Oh, cool. Well, I get the little riddles and logic puzzles from all different kinds of sources. So I hope you enjoy those. I think they're fun. And some of them are hard. And of course, when you hear the answer, you're like, oh, why didn't I think of that?
Yeah.
It seems obvious. Well, we are now finished with this meeting. If you just arrived, I'm sorry. I did record it. I better stop recording.